In today's lecture, we're going to talk about algae and bryophytes. We'll talk about why that word is in quotes a little bit later. In the background of this slide, you see a moss, and this moss is unusual because it grows in desert conditions. We'll talk later in this lecture about the fact that most bryophytes, including mosses, require moist conditions, so most could not survive in the desert. We're going to start by talking about algae. Algae are not plants, as most people define plants. However, they are the photosynthetic organisms that gave rise to plants. There are many different varieties. We will talk about just a couple of important single-cellular ones. The ones we will focus on are diatoms and dinoflagellates. We will then talk about some multicellular algae too, which often get lumped under the category of seaweeds. We'll say that green algae are the ancestors of terrestrial plants, and then we will talk about some of the changes necessary when some algae transitioned to becoming land plants. Then we will talk about three groups of bryophytes. These are the liverworts, and the liverworts are the descendants of the earliest land plants. We'll talk about mosses. Mosses are the most abundant and recognizable bryophyte. I'm sure you've all seen some. And we will talk about hornworts. And hornworts are the most rare of these three. However, they are the closest relative to all of the other living vascular plants, and so they are important. We will start with algae. Algae are a diverse group of aquatic photosynthetic protists. Algae are eukaryotes. We've already talked about this term. Remember, this means that the cells have membrane-bound organelles, including a nucleus where the DNA is. Algae can be single-cellular or multicellular, as we alluded to earlier, and we will talk about both. And the ancestor of land plants was an algae, which makes it relevant to what we are talking about. So the two single-cellular algae, diatoms and dinoflagellates, both contribute to the phytoplankton that occurs within oceans or lakes. Phytoplankton is a term that refers to microscopic, floating, photosynthetic organisms. The phyto is the plant part. Even though they're not plants, they do photosynthesize. We'll start by looking at diatoms. Diatoms occur both in freshwater and marine environments. By marine we mean saltwater, so oceans and seas. And these are especially important organisms for the oceans because they are the base of the marine food chain. And numbers or estimates vary widely, but somewhere around half of the photosynthetic production of oceans comes from diatoms. That means somewhere around half of the food that eventually gets produced that becomes food for things like fish is coming from diatoms. You can see that diatoms have a very interesting array of shapes, and they are beautiful to look at, but the catch is you have to look at them through a microscope because these are single-cellular. Most diatoms have silica shells, and the shells are shaped sort of like stacking jar lids. So one overlaps the other and the two pieces come together to enclose the organism. This is an electron micrograph, so a very up-close look at a diatom. And you can see that the shell is in fact filled with many tiny holes. That's going to be important for how humans use diatom shells. When diatoms die, then their shells oftentimes settle down to the bottom of the ocean, and we can get huge collections of these shells, which form a material called diatomaceous earth. And then we can collect that diatomaceous earth and use it for various purposes. Two places where you might see it used or even buy it. The first one is water filtration. So if you have a pool pump, for example, you may need to fill it with diatomaceous earth. And this is going to be a useful material to put into a filter because the holes allow water to come through, but the material will catch contaminants in the water that are trying to flow through. So if you're trying to remove small solid particles, then passing water through many millions of these shells can be an effective way of doing so. We can also use diatomaceous earth as a pest repellent. The idea here is that these shells can be sharp, and the pieces are so tiny that as various insects walk over them, then small bits of this shell either get embedded into the insect's exoskeleton or they create small tears in it. Those tears then allow the insect to be exposed to the atmosphere, and they allow them to lose water and therefore die. Additionally, if you can get the insects to eat the diatomaceous earth, it can do some damage to the digestive system. I'm not sure how effective this strategy is, but clearly at least some companies think it's effective enough to market the product for this purpose. The second group of single-cellular plankton we will talk about are dinoflagellates. Dinoflagellates also can be freshwater or marine, and one distinguishing characteristic is that they typically have two flagella. Unfortunately, we can't see the flagella here because they've been removed to make these electron micrographs, but one of them would be in the groove like here, the other one would typically stick straight out. Dinoflagellates are important for a couple of reasons. The first is something we would think of as a good reason. They can associate with coral that forms coral reefs. So coral itself is an animal. It's actually a jellyfish relative, and it forms large colonies. So this, in other words, is not one coral, but it's many, probably thousands of corals. And each individual coral secretes a shell around it. Those shells in aggregate eventually form coral reefs. Most corals don't live by themselves. Instead, they have a symbiotic relationship with dinoflagellates. A symbiotic relationship is one where the two organisms are intimately connected for at least large portions of their lives. In this case, the dinoflagellate is going to live within the coral, and it's going to exchange materials with the animal. Specifically, the dinoflagellate will supply oxygen and organic matter that it makes from the process of photosynthesis. This is basically providing both gas for respiration and also something for the coral to eat. The organic matter could be things like sugars. In exchange, the coral is also providing material for the dinoflagellates. First, it's providing carbon dioxide. That's, of course, the waste product of respiration, but it's also the gas that the dinoflagellate needs to do photosynthesis. Then, secondarily, the coral is providing a home at a consistent level in the water where the dinoflagellate can stay without worrying about getting washed down, maybe to somewhere out of the photosynthetic depths in the ocean. We'll now focus on a less desirable aspect of dinoflagellates. This is the formation of red tides. And if you have been near the coast, especially maybe in the Gulf area, you may have heard of this. So in coastal areas with high levels of nutrients, oftentimes these nutrients are a result of pollution, like let's say agricultural runoff or sewage. In those areas, there's a lot of nutrients in the water. These are great conditions for dinoflagellate populations to reach high levels. When the dinoflagellates reach high levels, unfortunately, some species can produce neurotoxins. And the neurotoxins then are abundant in the water, and they can accumulate in shellfish, which is eventually bad for the shellfish, but also bad for humans who eat those shellfish. Additionally, if they accumulate in high enough doses, then they can kill fish living in that water, and they can harm humans who, let's say, go swimming in the water. So you can see in this picture, there's red off the beach, and there's a sign warning you that there's a harmful algal bloom and do not go into the water. You can see the beach is closed. A second problem with any time a phytoplankton reaches really high densities like this is that eventually those phytoplankton are going to die. And when they do die, then they are going to use up, in the process of decomposition, they will use up all of the oxygen in the water. And animals in the water need oxygen to survive, and so when the oxygen levels get too low, this can kill fish. That ends our discussion of a couple of single cellular algae. We'll now move on to the multicellular algae. And we'll use the term seaweeds, as we mentioned earlier, for large marine algae. These are multicellular, photosynthetic, and protists. There are several different groups. The groups that we are most familiar with are the red, brown, and green algae. And these can be important. They do perform photosynthesis and hence provide organic matter and also oxygen in the water. They additionally are important for creating habitat. So a marine environment without any seaweeds is going to be empty, and there's not going to be, for example, hiding places for fish, or surfaces for fish to feed on, or surfaces for arthropods like crabs to crawl around on. So by creating a habitat that is complex, there are more different niches available for different kinds of animals, and we can get a more diverse animal life and also higher densities. So this can be important for, let's say, spawning fish, which can be important to humans because we like to eat fish. So one thing that we try to do to maintain fisheries is protect areas that do have large amounts of seaweeds like this from damage during the fishing process, so there's a place for fish to spawn. Humans use seaweeds more directly as well. We use seaweeds for food. This is especially common in some Asian countries, but you can experience this pretty easily in the US as well. Some common seaweeds for eating include nori and dulse, and so nori is the seaweed that is used to wrap sushi. We also eat seaweeds without knowing it in some food products. So carrageenan is a common food product. It's used as a thickener and stabilizer. You'll often find it in cheap ice cream. And you'll also find agar sometimes in food. For example, this is a Japanese snack that's made out of red beans and agar. Another place you'll see agar is in petri dishes. So for example, if you look at your fern gametophyte petri dish, which you are growing now, the substance in it on which we are growing the gametophytes is in fact agar. Finally, seaweed can be collected and spread on fields for use as a fertilizer. One group of seaweeds, actually, I should be careful about the term seaweed. These are mostly freshwater, not marine. But one group of macroscopic green algae that is important to us are the charophytes. The charophytes are going to be important because the charophytes are probably the group of algae that gave rise to the terrestrial plants. These mostly occur in shallow fresh water, and as you can see in this photograph, they have complex growth forms. So they're not just flat blades, but they branch in ways that sort of superficially resemble a plant. These do require water. However, there's at least one life stage that can dry out and survive fairly long periods of time out of the water. And other life stages can survive at least short periods of time with partial air exposure. So for example, if this plant was lying on wet mud, then even if it wasn't completely covered with water, it could probably survive for a while. That could be important because these two things can give us a clue of how seaweeds eventually made the transition to being land plants. Perhaps initially the seaweeds could only be exposed for a short amount of time to air, and eventually, due to natural selection, they could withstand more and more time exposed to air until eventually we had a plant that could survive its entire life in the air. The life history of charophytes differs from both plants and animals. We've talked about an animal life cycle and we've talked about a plant life cycle in an earlier lecture. The charophyte life cycle differs in that nearly its entire life cycle is haploid. We've said that animals spend nearly their entire life cycle as diploids, and we've said that plants alternate back and forth between haploid and diploid. Charophytes, unlike either, are haploid almost the whole time. Charophytes do have sexual reproduction, but at some stage in their life cycle, a haploid sperm fertilizes a haploid egg and creates a diploid zygote. We've seen that for both plants and animals before. The difference here is that for the charophytes, as soon as that diploid zygote is formed, it immediately goes through meiosis and makes haploid cells again. So the only diploid stage in this whole life cycle is this one zygote cell that then, as quickly as it can, gets back to a haploid state. So if this is the charophyte life cycle, that means there's going to have to be a change as we go from charophytes to the terrestrial plants that do have a diploid stage. You can see here why I am a scientist, not an artist. But this is a sketch of the charophytes, which we just talked about, and then the various different groups of terrestrial plants that we went over quickly at the start of the semester, and we will go over in more detail now. So the first groups to evolve were the Bryophytes, and I put this in quotes because this isn't one true evolutionary group. These are not each other's closest relatives. Instead, the Liverworts evolved first, and there was a second group that became the ancestor of all of these remaining plants. Then, out of that second group, the mosses diverged and became their own group, and all of the other remaining plants are descended from the other offspring of that division between the mosses and the other plants. Then we had the Hornworts branch off and become their own group. The sister group to the Hornworts, so the other branch, is the Liverworts. Is the Liverworts and all other terrestrial plants. So everything else here. And then progressively the Liverworts branch off, the ferns branch off, and finally we get a split between the gymnosperms and angiosperms. So to bring this back to Bryophytes, since these three groups did not split off together, we can't talk about them as a technical group. We talk about them as an informal group, and I try to indicate that by putting quotes around the word when I remember. So the remainder of this lecture focuses on this transition from charophytes to bryophytes, and then on the traits of these three different kinds of bryophytes. In the evolution of terrestrial plants, or of plants, there's two major changes. The first is that plants adopt a terrestrial lifestyle, that means on land. Second, we get the evolution of multicellular haploid and diploid stages. And put in the more technical terms, this means that we have both a gametophyte stage and a sporophyte stage. Because the charophytes only had a haploid stage, they only had the gametophyte stage. They never had a true sporophyte. So we've already said that the bryophytes were the first terrestrial plants, including liverworts, mosses, and hornworts. It's true that they will have both a gametophyte and a sporophyte, but unlike all other terrestrial plants, in the bryophytes, the haploid stage, in other words, the gametophyte, is the dominant stage. There's a sporophyte, but the sporophyte is always going to be small, and it's always going to be attached to the gametophyte, and it will always depend at least partly on the gametophyte for nutrition, so for sugars and other nutrients. Here's a couple of examples of bryophytes. We have a liverwort. They don't always have this flat form, but this is a form that we are commonly used to seeing. That you might find this growing on rocks near a stream, for example. And then moss. Moss has a variety of forms, but this is a typical one we might see. So some traits typical of bryophytes. They lack a thick, waxy cuticle. You'll find some readings that say they have a cuticle, some that say they don't. What we're going to focus on is that they don't have one that's thick and waxy enough to defend them against desiccation. This means that most bryophytes cannot live in dry environments. That desert moss was an exception to this. Second, the bryophytes all have pores for gas exchange. These pores are like stomata, but not all of the bryophytes are able to open and close their stomata. In many of them, the stomata stay open the whole time. This means, again, if it gets dry, then they are in danger of drying out. Finally, all of the bryophytes lack well-developed vascular tissue. They can transport materials in water short distances, but they can't do it long distances. This means that bryophytes are always going to be small. We'll find them growing up to a few centimeters, but not typically any taller than that. You've seen this slide before. This slide shows a typical plant life cycle. And I will go over it here, then we'll talk about how to modify it to represent a bryophyte and other terrestrial plants. Let's start with a spore. Remember, a spore is going to be haploid, or 1N, and a spore is going to go through mitosis, creating identical cells and creating, in this case, a multicellular organism. This haploid multicellular organism is our gametophyte. Then for most of the bryophytes, this will either be male or female. If it is male, then by the process of mitosis, it will make sperm. If it is female, then by the process of mitosis, it will make an egg. Then, eventually, an egg hopefully will, or rather a sperm will reach an egg, and fertilization will occur, resulting in the formation of a zygote. Since they each contribute their DNA, we now have a diploid organism, or 2N. The zygote then is going to go through mitosis, and this is the stage that would not happen in a charophyte, but in a bryophyte it does. The zygote goes through mitosis and creates another multicellular organism. Since this is diploid, we're going to call it the sporophyte, and the sporophyte can use the process of meiosis to make spores again, and this cycle can repeat. That is a generic life cycle that applies to both the bryophytes and other terrestrial plants. If we're going to modify this to represent the bryophytes, we don't really need to change anything except the sizes. So the only thing I've changed here is I've made the sporophyte very small, and I've made the gametophyte a little bit bigger. This just reminds us the gametophyte is dominant, the sporophyte is small and nutritionally dependent. Eventually, we're going to talk about the life cycle of all other terrestrial plants except bryophytes. In this case, the only thing we need to do to our diagram is make the sporophyte big, because this is now dominant and photosynthetic, and we make the gametophyte small, because this is now small and nutritionally dependent on the sporophyte. So the big change then in the life cycle is the relative size of the sporophyte compared to the gametophyte. Let's now talk about the liverworts in some detail, and then we'll talk about the moss and hornworts a little bit too. The liverworts are the first group of biophytes to have split off. Most of them are restricted to moist environments because of their lack of cuticle and because they cannot close their pores. And they do not all have this flattened appearance, but as I've already said, this is a common form we are accustomed to seeing. Liverworts, as well as the other bryophytes, do not have true roots. True roots would be multicellular organs that would have to include vasculature, ground tissue, and epidermis. However, remember the bryophytes don't have vasculature, so they cannot have true organs, therefore they cannot have true roots. These rhizoids are going to be one cell thick, so not wide enough to form a true root either. Nevertheless, rhizoids accomplish much of what a root would accomplish. They anchor the plant to the ground, and they are used to absorb water and nutrients from the environment. There's many different kinds of liverworts, and they all reproduce a little bit differently, but we're going to talk about one commonly seen way that liverworts reproduce. And the liverwort is in the foreground here. Ignore this orange stuff in the background. That's actually a moss. So liverwort gametophytes are going to make eggs or sperm on specialized structures. This is going to be true for for mosses and hornworts as well. When the female gametophyte makes the egg is going to stay attached to the gametophyte. So we have a sketch here of that ribbon-like shape, and there's this umbrella-like shape on it. The eggs are formed in these little tubes hanging down underneath the umbrella-like form. And you can see what this looks like in reality. The umbrella sort of has this finger-like look to it, and the eggs are underneath where we can't really see them. There will be male gametophytes as well, and the male gametophytes are going to make a slightly different shaped umbrella-like form, and somewhere on there the sperm are going to get made. Now the sperm can get dispersed a few different ways. There can be airborne dispersal, and I'm going to link this YouTube video so you can watch that. It's kind of cool. They can maybe be dispersed by arthropods, so things like insects, and then eventually the sperm are going to have to swim to actually reach the egg, which remember is up inside this small tube. Here's a sketch of a flagellated liverwort sperm. In fact, they are able to swim, as are the sperm of many other plants. We'll talk about that as we go through some other plant groups too. Eventually, a sperm is going to get dispersed and it's going to swim up and reach the egg. Once that happens, fertilization can occur and a zygote is formed. That zygote is going to divide by mitosis, still attached here. The result of that is going to be a sporophyte sketched here that forms underneath the umbrella. It's underneath, so it doesn't really have any opportunity to photosynthesize. Instead, it's going to get its nutrients directly from the gametophyte. It's going to become multicellular, and then many of those cells will go through meiosis to make spores. So now we have a sporophyte that's filled with all of these little dots representing spores. Eventually this will open, the spores will be dispersed, those spores can land somewhere on the soil, and they can divide by mitosis to make new gametophytes. We will move on now and talk about the group we're more familiar with, which are the mosses. Mosses are still non-vascular. They still have a dominant gametophyte generation. They still make rhizoids, not roots. So all of that is similar to what we just talked about. They are somewhat better at handling dry conditions than liverworts, which is probably why we're more familiar with seeing them. This is just a photo showing you some moss growing on a tree branch. The reproduction follows the same life cycle, but what the structures look like is different. So in mosses, we get these stalks, and at the top of a stalk is going to be an egg. That's a little bit wrong. The eggs are going to actually be at the top of the gametophytes, which is down here. So there would be an egg, let's say here and here. There will be male moss too that makes sperm. And the sperm again will have to get dispersed and then also swim until they finally reach an egg at the top of one of these female gametophytes. So to be clear, the female gametophytes here are the green parts. Ignore these orange yellowish stalks for now. When an egg at the top of the gametophyte gets fertilized, then a zygote is formed. That zygote can still divide by mitosis, just like in the liverworts, and that is going to form the sporophyte. So that's what these yellow-orange stalks are. These are actually the sporophyte generation. The sporophyte is then going to have a capsule at the top, and inside that is going to be where cells go through meiosis and make spores. You can think about, why is it useful to make this tall structure? Well, the spores don't want to disperse just back right next to the parent because that space is already occupied. They want to try to get somewhere new. So by getting raised up, they have a better chance of getting caught in the wind and getting to disperse some further distance away. So the difference here between the liverworts and the moss is that for the moss, instead of having a small sporophyte underneath the gametophyte, in this case, the sporophyte is starting at the top of the gametophyte and then growing upward. This is going to be important because what we're working towards is eventually all of the vascular terrestrial plants which have a dominant sporophyte generation. So if we compare the liverwort here with its tiny sporophyte hanging downwards to this moss with its larger sporophytes pointing upwards, we're getting a little bit closer to most other terrestrial plants. The final group we need to talk about are the hornworts. We said the hornworts are the most rare, but they've got some important changes that get us really close to other terrestrial plants. Their appearance is actually more similar to the liverworts than it is to the mosses. They often have this ribbon-like growth form along the ground. Their sporophytes sort of resemble the moss ones. They are these horns that give the plant its name. The word wort, incidentally, just means small plant. So hornwort literally means small plant with these horns growing out of it. In this case, unlike the mosses, the sporophyte is actually touching the ground. Right? It's not growing from the top of the plant, but it's growing right next to the soil. And you see here that the sporophytes are green. For the mosses, they were mostly yellow. That's an indication that the moss sporophytes are not photosynthesizing, but the hornwort sporophytes are photosynthesizing. That means that they are not as nutritionally dependent on the gametophyte as they are in the mosses. In fact, you can do an experiment. Once this horn has formed, you can literally cut off the gametophyte down here, and the sporophyte can still survive. So this is a really big step towards being like all other terrestrial plants, where the sporophyte takes care of itself. The sporophyte is going to have cells all through this column that go through meiosis. It's going to make many spores. eventually this column will open up and those spores will disperse. So if we're trying to understand how plants transition from charophytes, which had no multicellular diploid stage, to normal terrestrial plants, which are dominated by a multicellular diploid phase, we've gotten most of the way there. By the time we've reached hornworts, we have a multicellular diploid phase that is able to do photosynthesis and able to acquire some of its own nutrition because it's touching the ground. When we pick up in our next lecture, we're going to talk about the lycophytes, which is a small group of plants that gives us our next clue about how terrestrial plants evolved. In that case, we are going to see that the sporophyte is then the dominant plant, and the gametophyte has receded to being a very small plant, less important in the life cycle. Some final thoughts from today's lecture. Number 1, algae are important in aquatic food webs and in global carbon cycles. So we've talked about the fact that especially phytoplankton are responsible for a lot of photosynthesis. Therefore, they're producing a lot of the food in the ocean. In doing photosynthesis, they're also helping to control the amount of carbon dioxide in the ocean and therefore in the air. Second, when we think about terrestrial plant evolution, there's many changes we need going from the charophyte to the typical terrestrial plant. In the bryophytes, we see a limited ability to withstand a dry environment. They're not great at it, so they're still found in moist places, but they no longer have to be underwater. Oops. Second, we see a transition from a life cycle with only a gametophyte generation to one with both a gametophyte and sporophyte generation. This is going to be important because it's going to lead us towards a dominant sporophyte. Remember that the bryophytes still don't have a dominant sporophyte, and they still lack vasculature. That's probably, both of these relate to why bryophytes are not the dominant plants on Earth today. Ones that have both of these adaptations instead have taken over, and we will come back to that idea in our next lecture.